meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the SIG Network Policy API meeting. This is a help group to SIG Network. Let's follow the code of conduct and be nice to each other. Okay, today BOA is first on our agenda. Do you want to?
Yeah, I
Go
just,
ahead.
sorry, I'm trying to dig up the notes. A couple of us met in like a one-off meeting with Tim to kind of discuss how to get AMP to beta. I'm digging it out, but some of the stuff is written below. So while you wait for me to do that, I think let's just move on to the next.
I think you are also next then. Is that
Oh
right?
yeah, so one of the I think one of the concrete things that was discussed was that there was this, I remember this discussion about core versus extended and standard versus experimental. And then I also remember that there was like a PR to make that whole thing consistent through the code base. Is that something that has already been finished or we need to do? Okay, started on that. So that's the one thing. I'm happy to review it if people feel like I can review it, but like we should just get that in, because then it would just make staring at the API self-consistent with, kind of the direction where we're going.
Yeah. So, I mean, the TLDR of that was that we actually decided that we don't need the extended part at that point, meaning that something is a part of the API which is stable but doesn't have to be implemented for implementations to be considered conformant. We figured unless there is like a very strong reason making some implementations, let's say, not being able to do that at all, unless we find such a field or such a feature, we didn't want to have extended features in ANP. We could maybe rethink that, at least after we write it down. I think that's what will be written down more or less. So it's not exactly like Gateway API is doing, because they have lots of different implementations and lots of features that are not really required, maybe most of them. We actually wanted to make sure that all the implementations implement all the features so that users of Kubernetes can actually switch between them using the same API.
Yeah, I remember this being a discussion that's come up a couple times, and Dan had some like particularly strong feelings about like the best experience for users is going to be to not have extended or optional fields, and making sure that because we have an API with a relatively small surface area, to just focus on making sure that the things that we plan to include in the API are possible to implement for all the implementations that are active participants in the project. And yeah, like we've had some let's say difficulties finding the right way and like ideal UX for handling this kind of stuff over in Gateway API. So if indeed it is an issue that could be avoided, it certainly makes things simpler.
Yeah, I think that also matches the feedback from Gateway API folks, that if you don't really need that, like, don't do it.
And the other thing is that if people want non-standardized APIs, we already have a whole bunch of non-standardized cluster-wide network policy APIs in different network plugins, so they can just use those. The advantage of having admin network policy is that it should be the same everywhere.
Right, so that was a long TLDR. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so that is being worked on by Surya. Surya just ping us in the channel. I guess we'll try to review that ASAP, considering it seems like we all have kind of an understanding of how that should look like. So hopefully that won't take too much time. And Bobo, I'm afraid your summary of our meeting is the only thing that's left on the agenda.
Oh, what about these this discussing Tim's recommendations?
Okay. So sorry, I thought it's a part of this. Okay.
No, that
Sorry,
was not for me.
Right.
I put that in. I forgot to put my name on it. I know. I think maybe Dan took more notes in the
meeting with Tim, more detailed notes, but I th the concrete things I remember Tim bringing up. One was that he doesn't like the name priority for a field because it is high priority a low number or a high number and that kind of thing. And can we pick something better? Another one was, can we use the same CRD for both the ANP and BAMP piece, which would require us to introduce some kind of field to say, is this an ANP as we're thinking of it, or a BAMP as we're thinking of it? And then there was a wild idea. I didn't put this one in, but about kind of making it like Gateway API, where you have all kinds of different plugin policies. So the goal there would be, like if you install a network focused plugin, it would say, I support network things, and maybe I support like service account matches. And if you were to install alternatively an L7 focused plugin, then you would get a bunch more different policy things. And then I think on Slack he thought he turned around and said he didn't think it was a good idea. I think it's not a good idea. I think making it too pluggable would, well, first of all, would send us all back to the drawing board, and second, I think you could have quite a lot of network policies, and making them super pluggable is going to make them very verbose and very like awkward to build and like have lots of cross-referencing. I'm not sure if Gateway API ends up the same if people have 10,000 gateway CRDs that are all linked together, or what.
I can happily offer some retrospective on that if folks are interested.
Yeah, I think this last one is like an interesting idea, but it's also in very early stages and probably not something we would like to consider a part of our beta plan. But totally maybe nice to.
I think even
talk
Tim
about.
wrote it back, so let's not spend too much time on it unless anybody thinks, oh yeah, this is the way to go.
Yeah, I think like now people just thought of it. It's just like one of the additional requirements that's not part of Gateway API is that it's hard to make mistakes with. And I think that's probably not true for making it super complicated like this.
Right. And I would say like combining ANP and BNP into one API is a big part of this decision. And then priority being there is, I think we've discussed that more than once. I don't know if there is any solution to that. So trying to find, yeah.
In Calico, we called that field order because we wrangled with that a lot. But it, like, users don't necessarily like think of it as order. They think of it as priority, and then at the last minute they write it out as priority, as order. So it's kind of, you kind of get people saying, I want a high priority policy. How do I map that into order? And then they have to link it to the Calico concept in our case. So I think it's a losing battle either way. Like, you can try to define a better name, but it might not resonate anyway.
No, I have a question.
If the consensus was to change it to order, that's exactly the same as what Calico has. So I'm not going to reject it, but I'm also like not pushing for that.
I have a question on the priorities, because we have a statement that you can only have one of a particular priority at a time. And if you have multiple, it's indeterminate which one is valid. That one, does Calico have that as well for order, or like how does that work?
Calico orders all of your policies. We use a tiebreaker, but we discussed this a lot with the different vendors when we came up with that that wording, I think. So in Calico's case, it's 100% deterministic. We sort the policies by order, and then we sort them by name. If there's a tiebreaker, that's just how we break ties. So there's always an ordering, but that's like that's how our data plane works. Like, it's an ordered data plane. We execute rules in a particular order, so it maps very cleanly onto what we have. But we sort of did that to death, I think, before.
Yeah, in admin network policy, the rule is that if you have two policies of the same priority that apply to the same traffic and request different actions, then it's undefined which action gets taken. But there's you shouldn't do that. You've clearly requested something dumb in that case, right? So the fact that it's not fully determined which action gets picked is not something you can complain about.
In Gateway API, the way this is handled is like two things that would conflict like that is through status and timestamps. So typically with the older resource wins, and then through status, the newer one that would be conflicting would get like accepted false. If we're going ahead with this like single order required thing, is this something that we could check in like a validated admission policy or something to like actually enforce this?
I mean, we could,
I
but
think
actually,
admission policy. Sorry, go ahead.
people do use that sometimes. So as long as you have non-conflicting ANPs at the same priority, it is kind of fine.
Okay, I can see how that would be more complex.
I think one thing that makes me hesitate is the statement that, by the way, you don't have to rat hole into this. We can spend time on other things. But if having having two AMPs with the same priority is a natural thing that people will use, versus like if you do that, it instantly gets flagged with the status as like, hey, I noticed you're doing something dangerous. Are you sure you wanted to do that? Right? There's like a big difference, because I think if it's like, oh yeah, you should do that, but then if they conflict, it's not clear like which one applies. That one feels potentially very scary, especially with respect to like a security oriented thing.
Yeah, Dan?
So, well, okay. So I was going to say something about priority, but sticking on this, I mean, fundamentally, if you say the highest priority rule is that we deny packets from pod A, and the highest priority rule is also that we accept packets from pod A, like, there's nothing sane you can do at that point. Like, the user has requested contradictory things. And as long as you don't literally contradict yourself, it is fully deterministic. But in the case where you've actually said to do two opposite things with the same priority, like, we can either reject both policies, which the user doesn't want, or we can say, well, you requested two conflicting things, who knows what you'll get.
Maybe, but shouldn't we just, I was assuming that if it was in the state, we would actually instantly raise a status, tell the user, you're in dangerous territory. Like,
you can do that.
Or should we stipulate that? Because there's like a difference between like a, like,
so
you could
part
do
of the
it
problem
versus
here,
like warning.
Part of the problem is that if you have one policy of priority 1000 that says pods matching label X, blah, 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 and another one that says pods matching label Y, and then it turns out that there's some pod that has both label X and label Y, then that may require sort of preemptively figuring out things that the data plane may not otherwise have bothered to preemptively figure out until it sees the packet.
Right, but because of that ambiguity, should we push users away from that state? Like, it's like you could accidentally do it, but if you do it, we're going to be able to, like slap your hand, be like, no, stop. Like, you should figure out what you really want.
I think
that is only easy if you do report two ANPs with the same priority, right? That's what we're talking about. Not actually trying to find if two ANPs with the same priority actually overlap, because that's fairly complicated.
Yeah, like imagine you have some user who's like very oblivious and they basically just create all their AMPs on the same priority level. Like that conceivably could happen, right? Pretty easily.
Yeah, so what we can do is report an event or some warning on that.
I guess even before getting to like what the consequence of it is, it's just like, is this something that from an API definition perspective, we view as like yeah, you can do it because it's hard for us to disallow it, but if you did it, we should basically say like, yeah, you shouldn't do that.
Okay, we have 3 hands up. I didn't see the order.
So I think, oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that the very last question which Bove asked, right? Is this allowed? In my opinion, I think it is allowed actually to have 2 different ANPs at the same priority, because maybe you don't want to exhaust your whatever 1,000 priority. I think we support up to 1,000 today. I can't think of anybody who does more than 1,000, but if they do, you might also want to just reuse your priority if there's no harm in it, right? I think that was one of the reasons, because we had talked about it. And one of the easiest ways is obviously to have some kind of a cell expression block, right? On making sure the priority field is unique. I don't know if that's possible, but we could have done it. But I think one of the use cases we wanted to address was exactly also that. And one of the ways I've seen our users use it is because we don't have tenancy today. If you want to be able to express, oh, I only want to talk to myself, not to anybody else in the cluster. Given that each ANP subject is just one thing, like, it's unique, you will have to create multiple duplicate ANPs to be able to express tenancy today. And usually people reuse the priority for that because each tenant is unique anyways. So the admin knows that they're not going to overlap. So I still think allowing overlapping priorities is fine, but and I also don't know how you can solve the problem of making sure you go and iterate over all the 100 ingress rules and egress rules to see if they're overlapping or not. So overlapping is it would be nice to solve problem.
So my answer here is that if we think that this is actually going to be a problem, that users are going to end up in the situation where they have contradictory policies applying to the same pods at the same priority, then that means that the API has failed. Like, we shouldn't be talking about what do we do to help the user in that case. We should be talking about how should we have designed the API instead so that this isn't a possible outcome.
I think Sean, your hand was before mine or after mine. I don't.
I'm not sure, but just in general, I feel like, yeah, we've had prioritized policy since the beginning, and I don't think it comes up that often that users kind of write contradicting policies. We don't document our tiebreaker. That's our internal implementation to make sure it's always deterministic, and we're not going to do random things on different nodes and things. But we don't document our tiebreaker deliberately because we want to steer people towards like explicit prioritization. But it's super common for people to have 100 policies at priority 100 that are all doing kind of similar things. The namespace segregation example that Surya just gave, or maybe it's like at priority level 100, you're doing all of your allow rules to your databases, but they're spread across 5 different policies. So people tend to do like a little bit of a step back design of like, oh, I'm going to allow a bunch of stuff and then I'll have some later policies that deny things I don't want. They don't tend to interleave things like on a super fine level. That results in a lot of conflicts. That's my experience.
Okay, I think I was reading the API and it made it sound like a stronger guarantee than what I'm hearing. At the same time, like each policy object has a priority, but then within each policy object, there's both ingress and egress. And that in of itself is an ordered list. And then now you could conceivably have some very massive set of rules that are all at the same priority, in which case it could very easily be indeterminate, like what actually happens from the user's perspective. Because within each, like, you know, when you get down to the atom, right, like in the list, they all have unique accept, deny, pass kind of rules.
I think what you're saying is only if the index of the, let's say you allow to X in one ANP at priority 40 and you deny to X in another ANP object completely with priority 40, but both of these allow and deny rules are at the exact same index of ingress. That's the conflict you mean, right? Like, let's say you have 100 rules in those.
By index, you mean the list order?
Yeah, the list order, the position in which you have it.
This is more of like a human mental model kind of thing, where it's like you have both a priority at the top, and then you also have a list of things that are also ordered. And it conceivably could result in like very large numbers of rules where the order matters. Like, how do those even interact? Like, is it the fact that one of the policies applies? Is it like you mesh them together? I guess what is stated there is correct, is that it probably is like very indeterminate what happens.
I think the discussion we had before was just that each data plane has a kind of a natural way of resolving some of those conflicts. You know, how our policy models kind of work today. And so we left it as an implementation detail and said, if you want it to be 100% deterministic, you should be prioritizing them properly. And that's what Calico recommends to our people who use, to our folks who use Calico policy as well. But we wanted to allow the freedom for the different data planes to resolve that conflict each in a sensible way. But I think the natural way for Calico to resolve it is to strictly order all the policies by name. That is just what we do if they're all at the same thing, at the same priority, and then we'll apply the rules in order. I think the natural thing that we worked out for Cilium to do was to like naturally prioritize deny rules at a particular priority. I think that was what Nathan was saying before. So a bit of a different way of resolving it. But again, the user can say what they want by putting a proper priority on it.
I don't think the multiple rules within each policy really change things at all. Like, I mean, it means that yeah, you can have more opportunities to create a conflicting rule, but fundamentally either the two policies have the same priority level or they don't. And in either way, it doesn't matter how many rules you have. It's if they have the same priority level and they conflict, then they conflict. And if they don't have the same priority level or they don't conflict, then there's no problem, regardless of how many rules you have.
Well, I think, like, I guess maybe it's good that I'm coming to this API kind of fresh, is I find this to be somewhat dangerous. Like, if it's dangerous, should we really try to push people away from it? That's kind of some of the things that like kind of float through my head. And then in terms of priorities being exhausted, it's just like, well, it's a number, like change the number. Like, why not make it 10,000? Is there a problem with that?
Right, so there is like a
I was gonna say, I don't think changing the range really helps because, you know, if you're actually planning out your use of priorities carefully, then you'll never have a conflict, right? You're only going to have a conflict if you weren't really paying attention, or if everybody tries to use priority 1, you know, or whatever.
I mean, I could imagine how you use some pod selector or namespace selector with a label that is not specific enough, and then at some point by creating something like a namespace with a given label that you didn't expect, you get an overlapping ANP that you thought will never overlap. So the question here is, like, we do currently allow this undefined behavior. There is this one very specific case of how you can get to it, and the question is, should we get rid of it? And I think the only way of getting rid of it is trying to make sure that there are no ANPs with the same priority.
I guess it's like a slightly different statement. It's like, is it something that is allowed because of various reasons of it's hard to validate, and then versus something that we should definitely flag and push users away from it, right? Like that's what I'm hearing, which surprised me, was that actually we, in some situations, would recommend that users actually have multiple conflicting, not conflicting, but potentially conflicting rules at the same priority level.
I don't think anyone has said that.
Sorry, what's that?
I don't think anybody has suggested that this is a good thing. It's just a thing that we cannot prevent due to validation. And so we want the system to not completely blow up in that case. But like everybody agrees, you should have unique priorities for every policy. The API documentation even says that.
Right, but we could go one step stronger and say you should actually add a status to the object to basically say, you know, like indeterminate order may be possible.
So I guess I feel like if you're worried about this, you should come up with a plausible real world example of a situation where somebody would end up with policies that contradict each other at the same priority level, and how this would happen, and why it would cause something bad to happen. Because I feel like if you think about the ways people are actually going to use admin network policy, this just won't happen. Like most policies will either be only deny or only allow, and they'll be fairly restricted, and then you'll have a handful of very broad policies that are small enough that, you know, they're individually created and carefully prioritized, and so you're just not going to end up with this scenario.
Again, I'm not saying that we try to completely disallow it, but should we enforce that if you implement this API and you notice policies of the same priority are sitting around, that you flag it somehow?
I don't think we should make it something that we flag just that you have two at the same priority, because I think it's fairly natural for users to plan out their policies in groups, and like forcing them to deliberately give them all individual priorities makes it harder to coordinate all the policies, and you know, you might need to renumber everything when you add and delete policies, and you have to maintain a free list of which policy numbers are available, and that kind of admin overhead, I think, gets pretty tiresome. It would be nice if we could spot that two policies do like actually actively conflict with the real state of the system right now. But unfortunately, that's a very dynamic thing to calculate because labels are dynamic. So you might not have a conflict when you add your policy.
I understand, like,
and it's just like, well, we could do that, but it's quite a big thing to ask the data planes all to do, and we still have the problem that the user has put two policies in there, and we need some rule for what we do or what we allow the data planes to do while the two policies are there and the problem hasn't been resolved. So that this was kind of, we were hashing it out, basically just trying to see what could we agree on across all the different vendors. And obviously, like, we could adopt one of our tie-breaking rules as the rule, but that means everyone else has to rework the way they do tie breaking to be conformant, and that wasn't an easy sell to everybody else.
I understand like
yeah.
you can't compute the overlap. So, but one thing that was surprising for me reading the API was that within a particular policy like level, and like let's say you have like two policies conflicting or not, they could each have individual lists with each item in the individual list also having like, because each individual list is as stated in the API is ordered, as in the things need to be applied in that list order. But at the same time, with the presence of this other policy, you have two things where there's like a very defined, at least from what I'm reading, very defined semantic of like a ordering, like first it says deny and then it says allow and then it has passed and then denied, like on this side and on this side. But then when you combine them, it's actually very unclear. Like the ordering basically doesn't work.
So, okay, I think you might be misinterpreting this. If you have a policy with priority 100 and it has 10 rules in it, and you have another policy with priority 101 and it has 10 rules in it, all of those rules happen after the rules of the other.
I think that's fine. That's understood. But what if they're both priority 100?
Then if they conflict, one of them is obeyed and the other one is not.
So it's atomic, like it's like either one or the other, because I don't know if that's actually what I'm hearing.
Yes.
At least having some consistency around there of like, is it atomic of like one policy wins versus like, are you trying to merge those rules and like interleave them and evaluate that? I can link some prior art from Gateway API where Quadrant has really gone very deep on like merge strategies for policies that may overlap. Let me dig that up. Drop in notes.
I'm not, again, like I'm not saying like we should inherit all of those things, but this feels to me like almost like it feels like from a user perspective, they might get very confused.
Yeah. I don't think that we need to go down the whole rabbit hole of defining all of those things, but like it would be helpful to have consistent decisions.
So if you want to have consistency while still allowing multiple objects at the same priority, we're basically introducing an extra layer of priority where you say, okay, if they're with the same priority, here is how the real priority is calculated.
I think like that might be like, I feel like we need to resolve this to make it easier to understand is my like very like from afar kind of looking at it, because I'm not certain it's like, given how dangerous it is, because it basically says like, well, for example, let's take a like specific implementation. Like, I guess specific implementations could say like, we behave like this to like fill in that gap, I guess, in the standard language. Like, is that, it seems like it's like something that every implementation needs to kind of fill in, because this is a security oriented API. So you kind of do need a very specific statement about what happens. Let's say you had to do a security audit and you found accidentally that you wrote multiple rules that intersected on the same one. And then now you have to evaluate like what was the cost, what was exposed, let's say, like in terms of, like some of these like postmortems, like would you just say maybe nothing was protected, everything was protected? Like at least each implementation would need to go through that exercise. That may have come out all garbled, but I don't know if folks understood what I was getting at.
So I think Dan put something in the chat that's quite useful to kind of boil it down. Like if you have two policies that apply to the same traffic at the same priority, there's going to be one rule in each policy that would be the first rule to match that traffic, and one of those rules wins, either policy A's first rule to match the traffic or policy B's first rule to match the traffic. So it's defined in that sense, but you don't, which tiebreaker is used between those rules is not defined. I think that's a good way to think about it. Given a particular piece of traffic, you you only have one possible rule from each of the N policies at that priority that could apply, and then one of them gets picked. And yeah, like we all had different tiebreakers, so that was the difficulty. So Cilium's tiebreaker was deny wins. Calico's tiebreaker was lexicographic ordering, and I think the OVN one is random in the data plane. I'm not sure.
But
Yeah,
getting back to
random.
this question. Oh, sorry, Surya.
No, go for it. I finished.
Okay, so I just wanted to try and like address this question, right? If you find actually at some point that you did have some conflicting policies and undefined behavior in your cluster, which means there is an allow and deny rule, and I guess you're only worried if something was allowed that should have been denied. And then you're trying to figure out which connections were affected. I mean, the answer is like some of the connections for which these intersecting policies exist. It may be none and maybe all of them. So that's where the undefined behavior comes. But is it like good enough to just say, yeah, you need to consider that all of these connections for which policies overlap could have been wrongly allowed?
I guess my question is, can we do better? Or because like having been involved in writing some of these security postmortems, it's just
but
like
so someone has configured policies
scary.
wrongly, right? And I mean, it's not really guaranteed that you get wrong configuration at the same priority. Let's say something was wrongly allowed just with a higher priority. And then the affected connections would be all connections from that wrongly configured ANP. If this ANP happens to be at the same priority with another ANP, the answer is still all connections from that ANP are probably affected.
I think that's fine. That one is like very clear, right? You write the postmortem, you're like, all connections are affected, this and that. I think the within the same and all the conflicts, it seems very easy for people to mess up potentially.
I agree with Nadia. I don't see that it is more likely for people to mess up with overlapping priorities than it is for them to mess up with distinct priorities. Like if you have wide-ranging rules if you have both wide-ranging rules that allow packets and wide-ranging rules that deny packets, you really have to be thinking about your rules like carefully. And if you get the order of two priorities wrong, that's going to completely screw up your policy as well, right? So either you have simple policies that don't contradict each other, in which case the priorities don't really matter, or you have complicated policies that do interact with each other, in which case you have to be very careful about the priorities, regardless of what rule we come up with for dealing with overlaps.
Yeah, I think my main thing is like, we're not pushing people away from having the same priority. Like you could have someone just write everything at priority 0. And if you do that, it actually is just like, it's almost like, well, you're on your own to determine whether or not that behaves correctly. This is, if you look at like the other network policy, like the core network policy, right? It's like very, very precise what happens when you add a network policy. This, I don't know if we can solve it. It just feels, can we do better?
So one of the alternative approaches, so the reason why we have priority is because there are both allow and deny rules, and we want to be able to have multiple admin network policies. And obviously if you have one network policy that says allow and one that says deny, you need some means of deciding which one to obey. So what we ended up with was priorities, but there were some other ideas, and one of them is sort of like the tiers idea that we had talked about for replacing baseline admin network policy, where if you had specific tiers where all of the rules were allow or all of the rules were deny, then you could have a baseline deny and then a baseline allow above that, and higher level deny, who knows what we call these tiers, but the idea being that then which tier you place the policy into determines whether it is an allow or deny rule, essentially, and then within each tier, ordering doesn't matter because they're all either all allow or all deny. I think when we were talking about that, we probably maybe didn't have pass yet, because pass obviously introduces some confusion, and you end up with the problem that, well, okay, does the very top level tier, should that be an allow tier or a deny tier? So there are other things that we can do besides priority, but fundamentally, if we want to have both allow and deny rules, and we want to have more than one admin network policy, then you need some rule for saying which policy is applied before which other policy.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to like open up this giant can of worms, but, or maybe it's a can of worms that you like stuff back into the can, but like, it feels like if people are going to end up writing lots of policies on the same level, and then in the API, it basically says like, it's not clear how this will behave, that it feels a little weird, but at least from let's say I'm a user and all I know is I'm writing a Kubernetes admin network policy versus like I'm using Kubernetes admin network policy and my implementation is, this system or that system. Like the experience where the user is kind of like doesn't know which system is implementing their stuff could be viewed as like incomplete, I guess.
You should never be thinking about what rule is the network plugin using to break ties. Like if you're at the point where you have ties to break, you've done something wrong. Or we've done something wrong by providing an API that allows you to do that.
But I think like, sorry, I'm trying to square that with the fact that you can write multiple deny and allow and pass rules all in combination in a rule list, because like the reason you would do that is because they could potentially intersect with each other, right? With respect to the predicate of matching. Am I interpreting this correctly? Like the ordering matters because there is going to be this potential intersection where you have the same, like something could match like multiple things while traversing the
Right.
ordering, but have different dispositions.
Right.
So like on the one hand, we're saying the user should be able to write independent rules, but then the ordering and kind of the way we're constructing it is like they will just write rules that probably will intersect.
I think
that's only if both policies are matching, all packets or something, right? I mean, the intent is not that somebody can write two different policies that both apply a wide range of allow and deny rules to all packets across the system. Again, going back to, in that case, it doesn't matter whether you have the same priority or different priorities. If you have two policies that are both matching the same packets, you have to think very carefully about how they're going to interact. The allowing over the same priority is more for the case when you have two policies that don't match the same packets. Like each one only applies to packets going into or a specific namespace, for instance. In that case, it doesn't matter at all if they have the same priority because they're matching totally different packets.
Sure if it's the perfect example, because it might open a different can of worms, but I imagine like people shipping software into Kubernetes, like we ship you a Helm chart and we say, oh, it's got some admin network policy that locks down our stuff in it. I mean, maybe we don't want to let people do that. Maybe you don't want people setting your admin network policy. It's meant for you, but like you don't want to have to make the Helm chart like respond to the priority levels that are already used and like find a free slot and all that kind of thing. So I feel like we can either kind of reject this idea that you have multiple priorities, multiple policies at the same priority. That's one way to sort of make it clearer what's going on. But I think that would make it very difficult to deploy some kinds of software, and it would kind of put an admin
Right.
burden on the user.
Although in that
the-
case, the Helm chart's priority not clear, you'd have to rewrite it anyways, right? What if,
Yeah.
what if you
But the
said
point is that
50 was
when
this?
I ship you some admin network policies with my product, like they're going to be tailored to my product. I'm not going to have an allow all rule in there, and you should audit my policies that I give you and make sure that I don't. But it tends to be that the people writing these kinds of things, like they're siloed about thinking about one particular thing and dealing with that. And you have a lot of ships in the night in your Kubernetes policy where you've got a group of things over here that are secured one way with this batch of policies and a group over there that are secured with that batch of policies, and having them at this being able to overlap on priority level doesn't matter as long as you're not matching other people's traffic. So I think in practice it's not as big an issue.
Okay, so I'm trying to summarize that as we just have 10 minutes left. We do have undefined behavior, which we warn about. We say don't do that, but it exists. API allows that. What we can do about that are just a couple things that we've actually discussed now, and then there are pros and cons to each one of those. We could disallow that on the API level, where we just don't allow users to create ANPs with the same priority. We could define that extra conflict resolution algorithm, like merge strategy, or use whatever was created first, or some other algorithm. And we could warn users about this happening, saying, yeah, only do that if you're really, really sure in what you're doing. Are these all the options that we've basically been discussing? Or is there something I'm missing?
Yeah, and also try to see if this is something we want to fix or if this is something you want to live with.
Yeah, I mean, at least warning in a way probably is the closest. Well, yeah, we just don't even warn is just leave with that, yeah.
Given we've made it undefined at the moment, I think we could have a V1 beta 1 or whatever that makes it more defined if we find problems down the road.
Yeah, I'll have to think about it. Like, it's like if it comes with the usage of admin network policy that users like here, it's like C++, right? It's like here, have this like here's a cutlery set. Or we could do something better. It feels, yeah. Okay, maybe I'll have to think about this some more.
Yeah, and I guess a big outcome of this discussion is also that when writing admin network policy, regardless of whether we have this undefined behavior or not, you need to be very careful in defining it anyway, in setting the right priority, in choosing which selectors you use. So there are actually many, many other ways to screw up your set of policies, even without defining them at the same level. That, I guess, was also mentioned in almost every of these options at some point.
So before we leave the priority topic, I had wanted to say before we got distracted into all of this, that I still don't know which order admin network policy priorities go in. And for instance, I have no idea if the example I gave before about priority 1000 and 1001 was actually correct or not. So yes, the name sucks, and it would be great if we could make it better.
Yeah, we need Sing linguistics just to help us find better names.
Yeah, the way I think of it is 0 wins always.
Yeah, I also keep repeating like priority 1 is the highest priority, trying to think about my tasks or something. And then it kind of works, but yeah, not for everyone.
Okay. I'm still not super convinced, but I have to think about it. It just feels like we're giving people a very dangerous tool, especially with the Helm charts. Like, but that's always been the problem with composition of things that are being written from independent authors.
Yeah, I mean, potentially with the Helm charts, they're supposed to, if there are different authors, they should be using different ranges of priorities. But if you only define something for your own namespaces, it will be safe. So.
And I would say again, if you want to try to come up with actual examples of a situation that sounds plausible where this would happen, that we could argue about, because I think what Nadia was saying before again is right, that any situation where overlapping priorities would be a problem, it would also be a problem if you just flipped the two priorities, and in any situation where you could accidentally use the same priority, you could accidentally use priority n-2 whatever, and just as easily. So
I mean, the example I probably came on top of my head is just that people just set priorities at like 0 or something, or like 1, and then just put everything on that one. But
I feel like,
but anyways, I'll think about this some more offline.
Okay, so let's see what else we have on our agenda today. I have got a bit lost. So Bowie, did you want to also finalize this topic somehow, the first one we were talking about?
I dropped the notes actually in the doc. It's in like a table. Yeah.
Oh, cool. All right, thank you. So these are the notes. We could probably just link the notes also. From that conversation, yeah, there are more questions than answers. So we'll totally be discussing all these topics here again. And okay,
so
this
I
one
think
I think
related
to,
to,
yeah.
Actually, like this one, it's probably, sorry, it was lost. But I think that one, that's another topic that we're probably not going to be able to resolve. But along with the priority discussion, I think what came out of the other meeting, kind of in the smaller group, was that do we really need another type? And the rules on that type are actually also very, may not be long-term evolution-wise, like be able to kind of maintain. Specifically, what I'm talking about is like the singleton aspect of it. Is I think in that meeting it was like, well, maybe some people will write multiple of these. At that point, we get back into this priority. So it's like, should they just be kind of squished together?
First of all, I think we almost agreed that it actually makes sense to try and make them the same object. And then if that's not the case, we probably should have a separate discussion. And then the problem we actually had is how to express that in one object. Should it be a flag or like negative priority, which is where the priority conversation comes up again, or if there is some other way to do that? Is that right? Or do we have some cons of actually making them the same API?
I agree with what you said of your interpretation of our consensus. And I kind of liked the tiers idea.
Yeah, like it seems
that
like
aligns with Calico's existing feature, having tiers that have priority internally. So that would be perfect for us.
Like, at least from a behavior perspective, it sounded like standard network policy is like allow, and then there's an implicit one that's virtual called deny if any one of those network policies are configured. And then yes, BNP would be just underneath that if like nothing was there. It sounds like that's basically how it should behave.
Right. So that part, I think we also didn't quite have the time to discuss thoroughly yet. So maybe we can think about that more considering we have 1 minute left before our next meeting, and then see which ideas we have. Or I mean, if no one finds the time to do that, then we could just
yeah. I mean,
them.
I can give it a shot to write up some of this. And it's okay. One of the why I'm saying like combining it is it also helps explain to the user the behavior, because I think right now I'm reading the API docs, and you actually have to read a separate API to kind of understand kind of how it slots in. Whereas if you just tell users like, here's how things are ordered or prioritized, it just happens to be number, X, and it's at the bottom or something. It's like way easier for people to understand than like, well, there's this new type and it sort of behaves like this, but like, it's a new type, so maybe it behaves a little bit differently. Like that's I think also just introduces complexity.
Yes. And well, I mean, hopefully that's also going to be better when we figure out how we join these two things together. Yeah, but the options on how exactly we can do that could be nice. And then we also totally should try to explain that to a couple more people. And if they keep asking questions and can't understand that, then we probably should try again. But currently it's been fairly difficult to explain this whole concept to the people who are unaware of this API. So we have a chance of doing a better job. Okay, so yeah, if anyone has more ideas, just share any document you may come up with during the next 2 weeks so that we can work on it offline. If not, we'll get back to this discussion on our next meeting. And then also, if you have any more thoughts on this previous topic, we haven't quite figured any agreement or outcome here, I would say. So, but I tried to write down some of the discussion points. So
yeah, thanks for the discussion, by the way. Like, you could use me as like a dumb user, kind of walking through the API.
Oh, totally. Thank you for asking questions. That's how we usually improve our API, when someone comes and tries to ask questions. We do see more of us have the same opinion here, so I know it's not easy to fight back with more questions. Yeah, but we do appreciate you doing that, actually. All right, so then I guess on that, we should be done. Thank you all for joining, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks. Take care, y'all.
Okay.